there is so much analysis of things in terms of race. I can't hear about any issue without hearing what percentage of what race it affects, even when it makes no sense to talk in those terms.
Hello, welcome to the channel. This week's guest is Dr Iona Italia, who's the sub-editor of Areo Magazine, which is an influential online political and philosophical publication. She also hosts a podcast called Two for Tea. She's written a number of books. She spent many years working as an academic and just generally has a really interesting and unique perspective on politics, in my opinion. That's about it in terms of the introduction. As usual, if you could give the video a like and subscribe, that's great. Yeah, enjoy. So, in terms of, could you just, this is obviously quite an impossible question to answer within an hour-long interview, but could you just give a quick summary of your life to date, like a kind of overview of how you've got to what you do now?
Oh God, I grew up in Pakistan, in Karachi. My father was born in Bombay. I guess he was Indian, but later went to Pakistan. And to me anyway, Pakistani Indian, it's the same thing. Then I came to the UK as an adolescent, and I went to boarding school outside London. Then I went to Cambridge. I studied English literature. I did a PhD in English literature, and I was an academic from when I got my PhD, which was 96 until 2006.
Yeah.
No, 95. So 11 years. I spent 11 years working in academia.
Yeah.
And I taught 18th century English literature. I also wrote a book called Anxious Employment, which is about 18th century professional writers.
Right.
And then I came to Buenos Aires in 2006. I got divorced in 2009, and that completely changed my life because I had naively imagined I would be married forever. And my husband earned a very good salary and also owns a very lovely place in London. And we, had one set of finances, but then when we got divorced, I was suddenly completely penniless. Nothing belonged to me, and I needed to restart my life. So I did freelance translating and editing. And for a few years, I taught tango, and I also occasionally toured in the States and taught. And I had a very, very popular tango blog, which I later sort of expanded and revised and made into the two books that I published.
What are the names of those two books, sorry?
So they're called Our Tango World, and volume 1 is Learning and Dancing, and volume 2 is called At the Milonga. And then I began working for Areo Magazine as the sub-editor, and then later I was hired at the company Letter, it's called. I don't know if you're familiar with Letter.
Is that letter.wiki?
Letter Wiki, yes.
Yeah, okay. So could you, because I've taken a look at that, but if you could explain what exactly that is, like what its objectives are and stuff, that would be great.
Sure. So Letter is a public online site where you can have letter exchanges with people. So if you have somebody else who you would like to discuss something with, it's like a kind of podcast in written form.
Yeah.
Instead of interviewing or podcasting, we could write a series of letters to each other on a specific topic.
Right.
And those letters will be public, and also the most interesting correspondences I write up for Areo Magazine. So I do some deep dive articles that look into the topics that the correspondence deals with, and then I also discuss the correspondence in that context.
So is that in response to things like Twitter making all conversations so short form and as a result hard to be in depth?
On Twitter, it's like you're shouting at each other inside wrestling ring, and
Yeah.
it has this gladiatorial feeling. There are all kinds of other people intervening and cheering you on or booing or whatever, liking it, or making snarky comments or quote tweeting. It doesn't encourage long-form, thoughtful conversation one-on-one.
Yeah.
And the performative aspect militates against people taking each other's opinions seriously. Whereas if you are writing letters to each other, of course, letters you could write each other very rude and snarky and cheap and nasty letters if you wanted to. Letters, there's nothing to stop you. But if you agree to correspond with somebody, then usually you will try to take their ideas more seriously and have a more good faith discussion. The format definitely nudges you in that direction.
I mean, that seems like something which is sort of mirrored in audio form by podcasts, especially the long form type, which have recently become so popular. So even things, I mean, there's so many different types, but something like the Joe Rogan show is, I think, the most popular podcast in the world. And some of those episodes are 3 hours long.
Yes, I just heard that he had 190 million downloads a month. That's astounding.
It's completely crazy. Also, it just, the fact that it's so long form. I mean, there are so many other podcasts like that as well, but you would never really see that on any other medium. You wouldn't get it on the radio or on TV. But some of these podcasters are pretty much the most influential people in the media kind of space, especially to do with politics.
Yes. Well, Rogan, certainly. I mean, Argentina only has 44 million inhabitants.
Yeah.
And he has 190 million downloads. That's insane.
And also the influence that they can exert. So things like when he came out in support of Bernie Sanders, did you see that?
Yes, I did, yes.
And that's just, I mean, the impact of that, I think, is probably much more significant than pretty much everything that, say, CNN might do over the course of a month, just in terms of the response.
Absolutely. And I get the feeling, certainly after what happened with Brexit and after the Trump election, that some of those official endorsements by the media are, not only do they have less influence, so the difference between the New York Times's announcement, which was made with all this kind of pomp and fanfare, and which most people just ignored, and Rogan casually saying, I think I'll vote for Bernie on his podcast. The difference in impact was huge, but also I feel that the official media endorsements are often counterproductive.
Oh yeah, definitely.
People feel like they're being told who to vote for, and people resent being told how to vote. So I think some people will really, if anything, when they see the New York Times endorsing Warren, that will make them less likely to vote for her. That's my impression.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And also you can see that even with things like, I did a podcast episode on this a while ago about things like Hollywood celebrities giving speeches at awards ceremonies as well. I think even if you might agree with a lot of the points they're making, the average, or so many of the viewers, will be instinctively turned off, I think, by the whole spectacle of that. I think it's got a similar kind of feel to it as the media really coming out in support of kind of the establishment position on certain things, whether or not you agree with that. Large parts of the electorate definitely don't take kindly to it. And I think you've seen the response, like you said, in Brexit and the Trump election.
Yes. Well, I think that there's nothing at stake when the celebrities are making their speeches or dressing all in black or having a vegan dinner at their award ceremony. They have no skin in the game. And in fact, it's the opposite way around. The social pressures on them are to spout the kind of liberal orthodoxy. I mean, I'm calling it the liberal orthodoxy, but mostly it's things that I agree with. So I don't mean to denigrate it when I say that, but nevertheless, this is the socially acceptable thing to say, and they're saying that at some very swanky dinner in their comfortable, beautiful clothes and things. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing bad about it, but it's not in any way courageous or heroic. Whereas, by contrast, in Bollywood, where actors really have a lot to lose, especially Muslim actors and actors of Pakistani origin, of whom there are many, because Pakistanis tend to be fairer skinned, and that is fetishized by Bollywood. So there are many Pakistanis and people of Muslim origin acting in Bollywood. And almost none of them have said a word in criticism of the Modi government's recent actions, because because there is something at stake for them. They are risking something. And so I don't even criticize them for not being more actively outspoken. I think it's courageous and valiant of those who are more outspoken, but I don't feel like we should despise those who are staying silent. It just shows you the difference in what is at risk.
Yeah.
When people are actually risking something, they're actually afraid and there's something at stake, many of them will stay silent, and I completely understand that. I think, on the contrary, it's when somebody like Deepika Padukone, who's had multiple death threats from the Hindu right, goes and takes part in a student protest, then that is very different from celebrities condemning something when it's already the kind of done thing to condemn it.
Oh my, yeah, I agree with that so strongly. That point about having skin in the game is, I think, also important, just in highlighting what I think a lot of people see as the hypocrisy, which is a lot of these celebrities weren't outspoken on a number of these issues until it became something which was absolutely risk-free. In fact, possibly most likely beneficial for your career to do, at which point they all started speaking out about it. So Hollywood has been treating people, objectifying women, treating different ethnic minorities in quite a stereotypical way for years. And it's only at the point at which it's suddenly completely standard to be outspoken about that they've all become really outspoken. I think that's part of what people see as hypocritical about it.
Well, I'm not sure that I would even say that it's necessarily hypocritical.
Yeah.
I think that mores have changed, and that's fine. I just think it's not particularly, there's nothing especially praiseworthy about it either.
Yeah.
And I did, of course, see I don't know if you saw the video compilation of all the different female Hollywood stars thanking Harvey Weinstein, that was just chilling.
It's so shocking.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And I feel like, I think we should be careful to resist victim blaming, even in the case of people who are very wealthy, because courage is always difficult. It's always difficult to put skin in the game, stick your neck out, risk losing your career, your reputation, money, or being potentially sued, or I don't know what else might be at stake there.
Yeah.
Being blacklisted, etc. All those things are frightening, and even if you have, it's much easier, of course, if you have that kind of economic stability. But even then, it's horrible to be hounded and dogpiled and those kinds of things. So I feel like not everybody has to be Deepika Padukone. We don't have to be scathing about people not being brave. We don't know how brave we ourselves would be in this situation.
Yeah.
But it's not praiseworthy, and so it feels kind of empty. I think it feels meaningless. To me, it feels meaningless.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think the other thing so actually one of the main reasons I really wanted to get you on the show is because you seem like a relatively sane voice on these issues. So for example, with something like Hollywood celebrities speaking out and the response to that on Twitter, let's say, or on social media, basically it'll be divided between people who think it's unbelievable and really brave and people who can't stand it and essentially just reject the whole thing as virtue signaling and all the associated values they find really appalling. And I can kind of see the instinct to watch those sort of spectacles and then be really, in response, be quite outspoken, like, oh, this is all just virtue signaling. But that ends up potentially kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because often what they're actually saying might be important politically. It's just the whole context in which it takes place. Like, once you get to a point at which most of the mainstream media and most of the celebrities are saying the same thing, some people instinctively have a kind of suspicion about what's going on, which might be well placed in some ways, but also you don't want to dismiss every point that's being made because they also might be valid. And there's a very small area for nuance between being kind of really far to the right on it or really far to the orthodox liberal left view. And you seem to be one of the people who can navigate that. And so that's what I really wanted to talk to you about on this.
Well, you know, I think that just as there's nothing wrong with, in a sense, virtue signaling. We all do this all the time. I mean, at least I do this frequently. I feel a need to pin my colors to the mast and state my position.
Yeah.
And there is nothing wrong with doing that with a position which is widely socially accepted. There's nothing wrong with that kind of reminder. Just as you know, I don't actually go to Gay Pride March. I hate marches and things like that. But you know, I'm happy to wave a rainbow flag, even though same-sex marriage is legal and all those things. There will always continue to be reactionaries. There will always continue to be pressure in the other direction. So you can go on supporting something and declaring it and writing, hooray, Norway have now legalized same-sex marriage, or whatever country it is, and putting rainbow flags and hearts all over your profile, or whatever it might be. There's nothing wrong with that, even if that is the accepted view in your tribe. That doesn't make that view wrong, and it doesn't make it wrong of you to declare it, and it doesn't mean it's somehow cowardly or something, or you're just kowtowing to the orthodoxy. Yeah. So there's that. And on the other hand, some people enjoy being contrarian and are contrarian for the sake of it, and they have made a niche for themselves in that sphere, and therefore having the contrary view to what everybody, the accepted orthodoxy is among your group, is also not necessarily, I guess there is a certain bravery about it, but it's not necessarily good. It's not necessarily the right thing to do. Some opinions are frowned upon because they are bad. And so I think that some people get kudos from just, ooh, I said this naughty thing that you're not kind of allowed to say.
This is one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about. So I definitely fall slightly into that contrarian mold, in the sense that I can't help the second I suddenly noticed that, whereas 10 years ago, almost no one publicly was making a certain set of points, suddenly 80% of the things you ever hear in any cultural context make a very select bunch of points, basically phrased very slightly differently to one another, or even phrased exactly the same as one another. My instinctive contrarian mindset just tells me, why is this, I can't focus on anything other than what is actually going on. How has that happened? But it doesn't necessarily mean that the points that are being made are wrong. So an example of something that's happened recently is I've noticed that everyone has become, in the last, say, 15, 10, mainly 5-10 years, there's been a shift towards this kind of intersectional, I guess you could say, woke outlook, which, and now there's a kind of general rejection of that by a large part of the population, and there's kind of a shift away from that in certain sections as well. And I find it really confusing, because I'm not one of these people who thinks that being woke is necessarily wrong. I think a lot of the points on an interpersonal level, especially, which are woke, are actually unbelievably valid. And I would never speak to someone from a different ethnic background or whatever in a way which is intentionally unwoke, if you see what I mean. But I also don't think that, so I kind of am worried about the backlash and saying, oh, woke stuff is all rubbish, because actually I think it has a lot of validity. But I can also see why there is a backlash, because people are confused by the way in which one set of views, which whilst they might have some validity to them, are still very niche, have suddenly become so dominant in terms of our cultural discourse.
Yes. Yes, I guess that, and I have to confess, I find the whole woke thing, well, I'm a little bored of it right this instant, but I find it generally quite fun to engage with. And of course, I definitely disagree with the intersectional approach. I think it's inherently divisive, although I know that that's not everybody's aim when they take that approach. There was recently, so there's a recent conversation on Letter, which I think is very revealing, between Andrea Lynn Lewis and Liam Kofi Bright. I don't know if you've seen it, about critical race theory specifically, but it applies to many of these things in that Liam argues that the ideas in themselves are perfectly valid. And Andrea says, well, maybe the core ideas are valid, but the way people are using them is very divisive and destructive. It's an argument over how we should judge those ideas and that kind of ethics, whether we should judge it by the theory itself, or the more sane parts of the theory itself. There's some quite insane ideas out there, of course, but by the general popular understanding, or whether we should judge it by how activists are using it. And I tend to think we should judge it by how activists are using it.
So do you mean something like critical race theory? Yes,
exactly. So I think these are ideologies that are meant to be used for political action, and so therefore we should judge them by how well they work in that context. And I think they are extremely counterproductive. And I very much feel that the way to go is a universalist way. So, for example, there is so much analysis of things in terms of race. I can't hear about any issue without hearing what percentage of what race it affects, even when it makes no sense to talk in those terms.
So something which you wrote, which I thought was really interesting and really useful, and which I definitely would agree with, is that disagreeing with, so you wrote this on a Twitter thread, but I'm sure you've expressed it in other contexts as well, but basically the disagreeing with the kind of crazier tenets of critical race theory or intersectionality and so on doesn't mean that you dislike people of color or gay people or women. It just means that you might not agree with aspects of a given theory. Which that's more or less the thought which is in the back of my mind all the time, which is I've been committed to getting rid of racism and homophobia and so on my whole life. Like, I'm Jewish, so I obviously don't want people to be anti-Semitic or racist. But at the same time, I don't think that disagreeing with certain things which just don't seem to make sense or stand up as theories or have problems with them, it doesn't even mean that they're completely wrong. They might just have problems that you want to point out, makes you instantly someone who's bigoted. You might just have a problem with the theory itself.
Right, you just disagree with the theory. I also think that, wait, what was I about to say? This is what happens when you get old. I also think that, really, with the exception of a few very obsessive racists who you can find in kind of on all sides, I think that most people actually don't judge people by their skin color, and they don't agree or disagree based on their skin color. And I see this even with woke people who say, listen to black people, or whatever it might be, let's say. But when black people come along who disagree with them, of course they don't listen to those people.
Exactly.
Those people. And Of course not. That's what makes sense. Everybody is listening to the substance of what people say. They want to know, do I agree or disagree with these people? And they signal boost or oppose or whatever accordingly. And that everybody does that across the board. Yeah. It's just that I feel that some people pretend that that's not what they're doing, but it is always what they're doing. And that's why you have some people tying themselves in all kinds of really unpleasant knots and talking about people who are race traitors, etc. They're trying to kind of somehow get their heads around or deal with the cognitive dissonance of believing that they're listening to and respecting people of certain races, and then people who fit that group, having to deal with people who fit that group with whom they strongly disagree.
Yeah.
And they really don't need that kind of justification. It's normal that we judge people by personality, issues, agreements and disagreements, and not by race. That's quite normal. They're just doing that as well. Of course, they prefer Ta-Nehisi Coates to Candace Owens, you know.
Or Kanye
of course.
West.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So with something like intersectionality, that's one of those issues. So I do think that there is validity to some aspect of that viewpoint. I don't like the idea of saying it's all rubbish, but I do understand why some people would just respond by saying that, because sometimes it can feel like you just want to be like, oh, stop making the same points over and over again. So I don't want to say that, for example, someone who's from a certain ethnic background hasn't got a particular lived experience of things that should be listened to and should be taken into account. With something like intersectionality, though, where it often falls down is there's a kind of an idealized group definition which is imposed on a group by the people who subscribe to that ideology as a way of making it easier to use the ideology. So they'll say, oh, but you can't make that point because you're a straight white male. And then someone who's in the audience who might be a gay Jewish guy or a black guy or something might say, oh no, but I agree with the straight white male. And then the intersectional person will often retort by saying, okay, but you're just siding with the white viewpoint. So therefore you don't actually count as an ethnic minority for the purposes of this discussion because you disagree with what I've decided an ethnic minority viewpoint should be. And that actually just becomes, if not racist, kind of, it's ridiculous. A racialized way of thinking.
Yeah, it's completely ridiculous. The theories, which are the original theories that are behind a lot of the critical race theory, intersectionality, etc., are much more extreme and much worse than you think they are. Although, of course, most people, when they allude to those theories, they're thinking of their own understanding of them, which is a much more benign and even kind of truistical understanding. So many people just think it's about being nice to everybody and treating everyone as equals. And that's not what the theories are about. And the problem is that the activists have run with the more extreme and pernicious aspects of the theory.
Yeah. So, I mean, on that note, I know that so was it Helen? She was part of the grievance studies hoax. But could we just to summarize the hoax, just for the purposes of anyone who doesn't know what I was referring to, could we just give an overview of what that was?
Sure. Well, so Helen, James Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian wrote a series of academic papers which were heavily theoretically informed, and they sent them into various journals which accept a lot of work of that nature. And some of the journals were quite prestigious journals, especially Gender, Place and Culture and Hypatia were two of the journals which accepted their work. And many of these papers were accepted, and sometimes revisions were suggested, but the revisions were often along the lines of making the theory more extreme and more ludicrous than it already was. you can, in Areo, we published a rundown of all the papers, and there's a large Google Docs document. So you can see that if anybody is skeptical about this, you can see that I'm correct. All of the comments and other things have been recorded and kept.
Right.
And in fact, they won a prize for one of the papers, which was about, which was arguing that the way that dogs behave when they attempt to hump each other at a dog park is symptomatic of, shows that we live in a patriarchal society.
Right.
Dogs' behavior is basically influenced by human sexism.
Yeah.
And in order to change this, we should train human men in the same ways we train dogs. This paper won a prize.
Oh my God. Yeah, that is incredible. And it seemed to get quite a lot of coverage, at least, so which I think was quite probably. I mean,
Yes.
it gets open to the idea that might be going on, which is probably quite helpful.
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of different problems bound up in this. I think that probably the major problem is not the theory, but the fact that the publish or perish atmosphere in academe and including in humanities academe. And to be quite honest, I really don't see the point of articles in humanities academe at all. I think that humanities academics should teach and write books, but articles generally are almost unreadable.
Yeah.
95% of them are, if they're readable, they're not enjoyable to read, and they're only read by a very small number of other academics. And the reason those other academics are reading them, I say this as somebody who is in academia myself, is so that when they write their article, in the literature review section, they can show that they've done their due diligence and read the other stuff that's been published on the subject. So it's this completely circular, onanistic thing. Nobody enjoys writing or reading this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's universities' funding is dependent on the number of papers that come out, and that's just kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
In science, it's a bit different. In science, people's work is made public through papers in specialist journals. But in arts and humanities, I think the best contribution that we can make to the wider society is writing more readable books. But the theory certainly doesn't help. And I think that one of its uses is to give this veneer of quasi-scientism. I would say it sounds more scientific if you nominalize everything and use all of this impenetrable theoretical jargon.
Yeah.
It's not specialist language. So I'm not talking about using polysyllabic words or expressing things in a subtle and complex way. I mean, this is jargon that doesn't mean anything. If you try to paraphrase it, you can't. There isn't anything behind it. And it just is kind of, it's obscurantism, i.e. it's pretending to be clever, writing something you know nobody will understand, and hoping that they therefore think they don't understand because you're extremely intelligent.
Yeah. No, I did social and political sciences at Cambridge, and I was really, really close to doing further academic studies in that area, and just ended up not doing it, in large part because I decided that 90% of the stuff I was actually reading by the end of my degree was just completely deliberately impenetrable and actually had very little substance to it at all, and very few of the academics who were teaching me seemed to say that that was the case, or seemed to even pick up on the fact that that was the case, which I found so confusing as someone, because I couldn't read a paragraph and then just accept the fact that I didn't understand it and move on. Either I had to understand it to write about it, or understand why I didn't understand it. And often I would spend an entire day trying to figure out what it meant, and at the end of it just conclude it doesn't really mean very much. It gives the discipline a veneer of scientific respectability when actually loads of it is just complete jargon nonsense, which I find really strange. I don't know how that can be. I don't know how it's been able to successfully continue in that way for so long.
I don't know either. I feel it's pure signaling. And the problem is the system. The problem is that this is what is rewarded. So the fault is not with individual academics. The fault is with the way in which academic work is quantified and judged.
Yeah.
And I think that there is also in the humanities, I think that one of our strengths is precisely that any intelligent person should be able to understand what we're talking about. If you are doing political analysis, maybe in certain subjects where maths is involved, that might not be the case. But if you are analyzing Shakespeare's sonnets or you're analyzing a political system, it should be possible for an intelligent person to understand what you're saying. They might not be able to come up with the same ideas. That's where expertise comes in. You're the one who knows about this topic, but you should be able to make it comprehensible to others. And in science, that's not really the case. There are a lot of things that you really cannot make comprehensible to others.
Yeah.
You can do certain types of overview communication, and I read a lot of popular science. I love it, but there are many things which I can feel my brain shutting down, and there is no simpler way of explaining them. I'm just not going to be able to understand them. And I feel that some humanities academics are sort of jealous of science for that reason. There's a sort of kudos to it. They're more intelligent than us because they do the stuff that only they can understand.
Yeah.
So therefore, we're going to create some stuff that only we can understand.
Yeah.
And that is so backwards. It's one of our strengths is that we do work that could be relevant to everybody and could be understood and appreciated by everyone.
Yeah.
And so we should be placing a really high premium on not dumbing down, but comprehensibility. I mean, if I use a complex word that you don't understand, if you don't know what epistemology means, you can go and look it up and it has a meaning.
Yeah.
But if I'm using a lot of jargon that I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say myself, I'm just trying to sound impressive, that is just, there's no point to that. There's no use to that.
Oh my, yeah, I so strongly agree with that point. I also think that you said that you don't place that much blame on the academics themselves. I agree to an extent, but I do think it's kind of an intrinsically unacademic way to think about what you're doing, to write something with the aim of convincing people that a certain position is valid, but to do so by using language which essentially is as close to meaningless as it's possible to be.
Right.
And also, which is a way of obscuring the fact that you can't really defend your position in loads of cases. So I think that's one of the things which really annoys me about, I don't really know exactly the correct term, for example, critical race theory or intersectionality. I'm not sure there's one universal way to refer to that kind of general academic outlook, but let's just call it kind of pseudo postmodern academic.
Yes,
I don't know how would you refer to it?
It's really difficult because I usually call that critical theory as opposed to postmodernism. So postmodernism is the stuff from the 80s and 90s, the original people, Derrida and Foucault and Irigaray, all of them. And this generation of stuff, which started around 2010, people like Kimberly Crenshaw and Robin DiAngelo, that generation, I would think of that as critical theory as opposed to postmodernism. But some people use critical theory only to refer to the Frankfurt School, and they get
exactly
a huge twist if you use it to refer to anything else.
Yeah.
Not only that, but they tell you should actually be not only not using that word, but you should be talking about the Frankfurt School, which is really annoying to me. So now I've taken to calling it theory with a capital T.
Okay, fine. So let's call it theory with a capital T then.
Yes.
But so
critical race, intersectionality, etc.
Exactly. Because otherwise it's just like being in Monty Python. because you can never criticize anything because someone's like, oh no, that's completely different to me. Like I hate them even more than I hate the right-wing people. It's just like
yes, the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea.
That's actually exactly what it's like. That is completely mental. But but another problem I've got in terms of not blaming the academic, I do think that, so for example, I went into that course being unbelievably radically left-wing in loads of ways, but I guess in a more like old-fashioned left-wing kind of Marxist way, which I no longer really am. I'm not anti, I just don't really subscribe to an ideology, I don't think, in general. I try to just look at every issue in a kind of neutral way as far as I possibly can, although obviously I've got some certain core beliefs I view things by. But a lot of those theories, that outlook increasingly didn't seem to stand up to the reality of the situation in society now. So for example, I would start looking at the situation in the education system with the perspective that, okay, obviously most of this must be explained by racism. That might explain these, that must be the answer which will explain why these different phenomena exist. And then you would look at the details of the statistics and you'd think, okay, well actually this isn't really an issue to do with race. There are more complicated factors here which might not be explicable just through the prism of race. And when you get to that point, the theories, instead of addressing that and then seemingly changing, in many cases will just become more and more obscure in the language they're using as a way of avoiding the need to become self-reflective and actually update in accordance with what's actually going on in society now. That's what always struck me as really strange. It's like, I'm still committed to being completely opposed to racism, but I don't necessarily think you have to think everything comes down to racism if it doesn't. And the fact that the theory didn't seem to move in that way as well was something I found really objectionable and kind of intellectually hypocritical and vapid. And I think that's partly why the language becomes so obscure, because it's a way of covering up the fact that the theory can't explain perfectly what's actually going on.
Right. So, I mean, I do think that there are very long kind of, there's a very long tail to prejudices from the past. So slavery was however many years ago it was now, a long time ago. But you still have the fact that there are many fewer Black families in the States, are wealthier than white families, and you still have to explain a very large achievement gap, which can definitely not be explained entirely in terms of just race, in the sense of just having African ancestry, because Nigerian Americans are one of the highest earning groups in the US. And one of the most successful groups professionally, etc. But clearly there are legacy effects of, I think these are becoming less important, and they're becoming less important also for bad reasons. So fewer and fewer people are owning property and then able to pass their property on to their children, etc. And that's not necessarily because we're becoming less racist, but also because people are struggling more financially. But that obviously does have knock-on effects. The family that you're born into, and the family you're born into is what kind of family you're more likely to be born into also depends on what kind of families your parents were born into, etc. So some things will continue to have effects a very long time after the abolition of the legal injustices that led to this. And even after the disappearance of the racist attitudes that led to it. So I think that is fair to say, but to assume that nothing has changed, either legally or in terms of attitudes, is really seems absurd to me. And it also you can never make assumptions about any individual, and that's the real nub of the problem for me. The taking of this kind of statistical large-scale analysis and then using it to blame individuals and to stigmatize individuals. Either to blame white people for being oppressors, or to portray ethnic minorities as victims. I think both of those things are very dangerous and unproductive. If I already feel like I'm a victim, that society is racist and prejudiced against me, then, I mean, on the one hand, if we don't want to deny ways in which society is racist and prejudiced, but also this kind of idea that it's a foregone conclusion, that's so, it's so defeatist. It's not helpful to the people involved at all.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. I mean, and also another related issue to that is, so for example, with the way in which those theories tend to view groups of different minorities, that's was always struck me as something which is quite problematic as well. And so, for example, you could talk about what the Jewish community thinks, or what the Black community thinks, or the Muslim community thinks, and it tends to be the dominant stereotypical viewpoint that a good person from that community should have through the prism of intersectionality, which is given the kind of the status of the viewpoint of that community. But that means that those intersectional people often end up siding with the members of those communities who are actually oppressing other members of the communities with their outlook. Yeah. So for example, in certain religious communities, there might be very serious bigotry towards women or gay people or something. And if those women and gay people speak out against that viewpoint, often the intersectional community will view the people who are speaking out against the bigotry they're facing as siding with the white oppressor, which actually has always struck me as completely illogical. I don't think it can necessarily square that circle as a set of tools of analysis.
Well, it's very difficult if you think of communities as little homogeneous groups. I mean, there's no way of getting completely away from this. But I do not trust unelected, self-appointed spokespeople for any group. I think this is one of the things that Christopher Hitchens said. If somebody says we, if they speak in the first person plural like that, if they start declaring we think this and we demand that, do not trust them. Do not trust that person who is kind of claiming to speak for a group. Even elected spokespeople we should be careful with, because the idea is not that there should be some tyranny of the majority. People's minority viewpoints within their group also need to be respected. And I think that we have to both become comfortable with the fact that there will always be some proportion of people who will have extremely objectionable views. So there are always going to be, in the UK, for example, there will always be some number of Muslims who will have extremely conservative, homophobic, misogynistic viewpoints. Some people are always going to be conservatives or reactionaries or religious fundamentalists. And those people are still our fellow citizens, and we have to allow them the freedom to hold those views and live their lives in the way that they see fit. But we also cannot allow them to speak for a whole community. We can only allow them to speak for other people who share their views, and then we have to decide at what point do your views impact other people in a way that is detrimental? And at what point is it just your choice to live in that way, and therefore we allow you to live in that way? And we need to come to a kind of compromise. We need to come to a compromise there, and we have to be able to contemplate the fact that within every community there will be dissent, as well as in the wider society.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to be comfortable with living alongside people who really do not agree with us.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be able to somehow get some unified voice of, we're not going to be able to find the spokesperson who can say to us, well, British Muslims want X, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. That, I mean, so you mentioned Christopher Hitchens. So I'm quite a big fan of his work. But one thing I find really, really difficult to think about, and I'm kind of quite hesitant to even speak about, but I also think it is kind of important to speak about, is issues to do with kind of like radical Islamism and so on. Because on the one hand, I think it's completely valid that people in society have really serious concerns about that, just like it makes sense to have concerns about any extremist, bigoted ideology. But on the other hand, I understand why some people are reluctant to give it undue focus, because that might lead to sections of the Muslim community, for want of a better term, feeling like they're being stigmatized and too much focus is being given to them at the expense of other people. So I don't really know what the best approach to that is. I mean, obviously, I'm an atheist, so I'm equally critical of basically all religious outlooks. It's just that strikes me as something which is currently leading to some people dying. And I'm really reluctant to not say anything, but I also don't want to. I'm worried about right-wing, the far right, for example, speaking about that all the time and then leading to thousands and thousands of just decent Muslim people getting stigmatized or having a difficult time in the country. So what's your view on how best to approach that sort of issue?
Oh, gosh.
In one sentence.
That's so difficult. So I think that one thing we should do is to remain clear-sighted about the problems with things, even if other people are going to use those same problems to do scaremongering, which I think is what the far right are doing.
Yeah.
Even if people are going to abuse those ideas for their own ill purposes. So there are multiple problems. I think one is, one problem which I see happening with the far right, first of all, is this kind of scaremongering approach, which I see a lot of people doing. So I see this on the intersectional left as well. All men are dangerous, all men are rapists, etc. This is scaremongering, and it's not helpful, because either people will get incredibly paranoid, women will get incredibly paranoid, and so some women are going to end up paralyzed by fear, or they will dismiss it completely as a load of nonsense, and then people might become reckless. And I think that I see that happening with Islam as well. So when the far right are doing their gigantic kind of, they make it sound like 50% of London is kind of extremist Muslims. Muslims are, I think, 2% of the UK. Is that correct? I think so. It's much more in London, but 2% of the UK as a whole.
Right.
And about half of British Muslims are liberal and secular. So we're only talking about 1%. Nevertheless, of course, if some of those people are jihadists or terrorists, they can do a huge amount, a small number of people can do a huge amount of damage. And also they can oppress people within their own communities in a really terrible way that we cannot condone. I think that, when people exaggerate in that way and try to create an atmosphere of fear, it has this dual effect, that some people panic and they start voting for right-wing parties and they're really terrified. And I completely understand what they're terrified of. They're terrified of some very bad things, potentially bad things. And it's not necessarily to do with racism. A lot of it is genuine fear of genuinely awful aspects of Islam. And on the other hand, other people will look at this scaremongering and they will completely dismiss it. And that's how you get things like Rotherham, happening and a blind eye being turned to this huge sex trafficking scandal because of people's fear of being perceived as racist. So it's very helpful to keep returning to trying to keep things in proportion, because exaggeration has this doubly bad effect of people believing that the problem is overwhelming, and also people who believe there's no problem at all. But I think that it's a very tough balance to strike. On the one hand, I don't think we should be panicked by the fact that some people will live in our society who have very incompatible views on, who have views that we don't want them, would prefer they don't have. We shouldn't be panicked by that, by some number of people having very illiberal views, practices, etc. But at the same time, we should always be protecting individual rights. Groups don't have rights. It's individuals who have rights. And we need to be very consistently focused on protecting their rights, whether they are Muslims or not. We need to protect gay rights, whether the people objecting are right-wing or Muslims or Orthodox Jews or whoever they are. And I think that it's okay for different people to prioritize different parts of this picture. So, for example, I have really I have stopped posting very much about Islam because I'm much more concerned about Hindu nationalism and anti-Muslim bigotry in India. That's my priority, but that doesn't mean to say that I think we should now be suddenly condoning Islamic bigotry and homophobia and misogyny, including in India, where there are a lot of problems within the Muslim community. It's just, it doesn't feel like good timing to be focused on that. However, there are a number of people who are ex-Muslim activists and their allies, or who are gay men or women or feminists from within the Muslim community who are trying to raise attention to problems within their community, and we should also support those people. So we should in no way tar people like that as bigots, because their priority continues to be tackling problems with Islam.
That seems like roots. I mean, so to be really pernickety, so you use the term Islam, and I never know. So I know Christopher Hitchens would say that, but would you say there's any need to make a distinction between Islam as the worldview? Because obviously there are billions of people who subscribe to it, and millions of them have completely different attitudes and viewpoints to one another, and say like Islamism, but I'm not sure what exactly the best terminology would be. I guess it's like describing like the Westboro Baptist Church and someone who's a kind of occasionally goes to church every Christmas. They're all Christians, but I guess you need to delineate between the different branches and outlooks. But that's quite difficult to do when there are so many different ways of interpreting the same thing. So is your viewpoint that you generally refer to it as Islam, or would you say Islamism? Or what's your
so I think that Islamism is specifically a desire to establish an Islamic state. So I think that Islamism is one particular problem, but another problem is just, I often say conservative or traditional Islam. So another problem is just, for example, disowning your gay son. That may have nothing to do with Islamism at all.
Exactly,
I would say that if you know that somebody is Muslim, you can always, with individuals, there's no shortcut. You still don't, you can't, there are not that many things that you can assume at that point. Because people are extremely good, can live with a lot of cognitive dissonance where religion is concerned, and are extremely good at justifying things to themselves and rationalizing things and cherry picking. And some people are some people subscribe to more illiberal views and others do not. So I think it's about how strongly held are the more traditionally illiberal views that often go along with traditional Islam, I would say,
Okay.
traditional conservative Islam. So in the US, for example, I think a lot of people, including even women who are wearing hijab and things, are using Muslimness as an identity, but they're totally liberal. And that's very different from someone who is extremely conservative. But even within very conservative people, there are people who are very observant themselves, but they are not, they're not really impacting other people in society. And then there are people who are oppressing other people within society. So those are all, those things are all very difficult to unpack. And I think that you just keep trying to persuade people towards more liberal values. I think that a lot of the different perspectives are of theological interest only, and therefore don't affect my larger concern, which is universal liberal humanism and human rights. So differences between Shia and Sunni, or whether you're worshipping Sufi saints or not, those there are many variants like that, which are kind of irrelevant to me personally, but might be very interesting from a cultural perspective, but don't have any bearing on this. This is just about how liberal versus how illiberal your views are.
Yeah.